Good evening, dear viewers, and welcome to a new episode of the Daily Debate. I'm your host for tonight, Mohammed Abdurrahim, and tonight we'll be talking about the Egyptian-African relations. The Egyptian-African relations have seen a strong momentum over the past years, reinforced by a political will at the highest level to boost relations with the African continents in the fields of security, economy, trade, health, investment, and others. This has been reflected in the continuous coordination and consultation between Egypt and its African brothers to achieve integration and unity and confront the traditional and non-traditional challenges facing today's world. We'll be talking about the Egyptian-African relations in this episode, of course, also while taking a look at the latest important developments globally and how they affect also Egypt's relationship with Africa and with global powers. In the company of our dear guest, Dr. Milad Momtaz, the international relations expert. A very good evening to you, Dr. Momtaz. Always a pleasure to have you with us. Dr. Momtaz, allow us, please, as we always do in this program, and dear viewers, please also allow us first to watch a report about our main topic for tonight, and then we'll come back and start our discussion. Please stay with us.
Egypt's relations with the African continent have witnessed a significant boost since President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi assumed office in 2014. The Egyptian presence in Africa is not limited to the political aspect alone, but also includes economic, commercial, and cultural fields. The Egyptian affiliation to the African continent comes on top of the Egyptian foreign policy. It also constitutes one of the main milestones in the history of Egypt, where since President el-Sisi assumed office, Egypt has aimed to play an active role in various mechanisms of joint African action through stimulating cooperation between Egypt and African brothers in all fields, the matter which was shown by paying many visits and welcoming the Africans officials in Egypt. However, such visits witnessed the signing of many bilateral agreements between Egypt and African countries in order to support economic cooperation. The establishment of the Egyptian Export and Investment Guarantee Agency in Africa is clear evidence of President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's directives to strengthen economic and trade relations with the African continent. The launch of a financing mechanism to implement water and development projects in the countries of the southern Nile Basin confirms the Egyptian approach to support the development of relations with the African continent. The Julius Nyerere Dam project in Tanzania is a massive project being implemented for the first time by a consortium of Egyptian companies, which represents a significant addition to the expertise and work of Egyptian companies on the African continent. The completion of this dam is one of the most prominent signs of the success of Egyptian companies, which have gained extensive experience within Egypt. This project will represent a turning point in the activity of Egyptian companies outside Egypt, whether in Africa or even in Europe or Asia.
Welcome back, dear viewers, and many thanks to Manal El-Abiari and Khalid Abdelbari for this report. Recently, His Excellency the President visited Djibouti and received his Angolan counterparts, the current chairman of the African Union, on Tuesday. The presidential spokesman said the Angolan president's visit aimed at discussing means to cement bilateral relations and step up cooperation within the AU. The two leaders also discussed issues related to peace and security in the African continent. We are here with our dear distinguished guest, Dr. Milad Momtaz, the international relations expert, talking about Egyptian-African relations. So, Dr. Momtaz, indeed, the Egyptian-African relations have seen strong momentum since President Sisi came to power, and especially after 2019, if you remember, when Egypt was the president, the rotating president of the African Union, and I remember the president's words while he was transferring the presidency, that he said that Africa can still count on Egypt even more while it's not at the head of the AU. How do you see the past like 10 plus years and the momentum in Egyptian-African relations?
Let me try to connect dots. Okay, so we've been talking about the first 100 days of the American president at the White House. And if we may actually connect dots, I would relate this to what you've just said about His Excellency, President Sisi, about that our African brothers can rely on us. What this has to do with the first 100 days of Mr. Donald Trump. I think we have seen that the word itself and the 100 days, and even before the 100 days, I think Africans, they weren't really actually having any reliable partner, or rather partners to rely on. In other words, and I don't think I'm as pessimistic about this, since 1945 and even before 1945, but I'm talking about 1945 because it's the new system, the new world order. That system has never been fair and just towards Africa. And I mean it. Africa, has been suffering since 1945. I know that historically speaking, we gained our independence, and this is great, okay, on paper, and I mean it once again. On paper, that's great.
By we, you are talking about Africa. Yes.
Okay, and of course that it was a very important move. I wouldn't deny this. But on the other hand, we've been seeking help. We've been seeking credible partners, reliable ones, that we would rely on wholeheartedly, believing that they are very much credible. Okay, they wouldn't actually have like shortcuts, or they wouldn't try to exploit us as they have been doing for the last 250 years, or maybe more than 250 years. And I should remind everyone, okay, of the colonial era and how bad it was. And I wonder, grammatically speaking, if it's correct to put it this way, as we describe colonial era as it was. Okay, because more or less...
You're getting us back to the 1700s and I guess and the slave trade and if I read your mind correctly.
Yeah, but not only this. I'm talking about the exploitation, the massive
that's the clearest form of exploitation.
Exactly, of our resources. I know some people in the world, they would actually try to deviate that kind of discussion, or they wouldn't actually want us to talk about history. But I find history as very much alive in Africa. In most African capitals or places that you would visit, I think we see history in action. Okay, we see like constant reminders of what happened and what's going on in Africa. Once again, what this has to do with His Excellency's statement, I think it's clear-cut now. We need a reliable partner. And I think Africans, when relying on us as Egyptians, and I'm not exaggerating, they know for sure that we are very much reliable. When we say something, we mean it. We don't have ill intentions towards them or towards anyone in the world. But when it comes to our African brothers, we mean it. And we've been talking about this. And once again, let me go back to 1950s and 1960s. And that's not rhetorical by all means. If we go back to the statements being made and the visits being made by President Gamal Abdel Nasser in 1950s and 1960s, is that history, or that's our steadfast intention and a steadfast approach towards Africa? I think that's very much...
Well, Nasser was the biggest supporter of all independence movements, and Egypt was the biggest supporter of independence movements against colonialism in Africa. And I guess this is where things were really, relations between Egypt and Africa were at their best. 50, 60s.
Totally agree.
Yeah.
But what I mean is that, okay, it's not only independence. You may gain your own independence, which is great. But I'm talking about who would support you to go ahead, who would support you to build strong economy in your country. And I think we got our independence, but we've been looking for, as I said, okay, that reliable ones, reliable partners, that they would join forces with us, okay, in a very clear way that would be kind of mutual.
So are you telling us, Dr. Momtaz, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, I'm just trying to deduct what you mean or where you're going to. Are you telling us that obviously and clearly after the first 100 days of US President Donald Trump's presidency, it's clear that Africa doesn't have a US partner, and that it's clear, because you mentioned, that's one point. The other point, because you mentioned 1945 and the New World Order. So are you also hinting that the first 100 days of President Trump's presence in office means that, or showed that he is looking for a new world order, and that these are the new challenges, the new contemporary challenges of the world we live in today, and this is why it's even more important to rely on each other within our continent?
I totally agree. Okay, and let me quote a single word, okay, what you said, challenges. And I think the 100 days, okay, of Mr. Donald Trump at the White House, I think it poses more challenges. And I think in Africa, we are more challenged now, more than ever, in my mind. Okay, I was talking about the challenges that we've been facing since 1945 onwards, and now I think it's a new phase of challenges, because what I've been hearing, okay, because I've been listening to him for the last 100 days, and even before, during the presidential campaign as well, okay, and if we listen from that direction...
All the world has
exactly,
been.
we have to, in other words. But when we look at that kind of, from that angle of Africa, and how he has been talking and implying things about Africa, and his approach towards Africa, I think, I have to put it this way, it's a new wave, a new era of exploitation. To put it straightforwardly, okay, because he was talking about, okay, that some countries in Africa, as in what, as highly resourceful and, you know, wanting to take advantage of this. And he was talking negatively about South Africa because they've been talking about, okay, some new policies being implemented in South Africa. And we're talking about, okay, that's what he wants to directly intervene.
But we know why he talked negatively about South Africa.
Yeah, I get it, but that's an example.
Because South Africa is one of the major, if not the major, supporter of the Palestinian cause in international courts.
Okay, totally agree once again. But if we go back, and by the way, that makes it worse, by the way. Why? Because okay, we are supposed to be, by the way, once again, we are truly independent, but we are supposed to be acting, okay, with our, okay, according to our free will, in other words. But we don't see this nowadays. So we are not being only challenged economically in terms of being exploited, but we're being challenged, as you have just said, you know, when it comes to our politics, our attitudes, okay, our view of the world itself and how things are happening.
And although no one really, you know, took him seriously, but he's also challenging the sovereignty of the Suez Canal, for instance. I mean,
I would like to, if you don't mind, I know it's a little bit off topic, but I don't think in my mind, when it comes to politics, something is off topic, because everything is connected. Okay, when it comes to Suez Canal, this has to do with Africa once again.
Of course.
This is Africa. And this is actually one of the most important maritime routes in the world. And when saying that, okay, it's not what we have done a lot, and I still actually don't get it. By the way, you're not talking about, okay, Panama, by the way. You're talking about, okay, the Suez Canal. And the historical context is totally different. Totally different. But one thing I'd like to remind, and I do that always to myself, okay, despite the fact that I truly appreciate history, but I always remind myself that the man at the White House does not like history. He doesn't like history. Okay, he doesn't want to talk about history, you know, because he believes
or
that
maybe
it's about present time.
In some
Cases.
analysts' words or some experts' words, he knows little about history. I mean, it's not my words, but you know, some top figures here and there are doubting his real knowledge of history and some of the theories that he implies based upon wrong data from history.
I think that's an intentional, okay, avoidance. He doesn't want to talk about this. But, okay, of course I know that he knows little about this. Okay, I get that fact. It's a very important fact. But he doesn't want actually to bring up this because he knows that, okay, it won't be in his favor. It won't serve his goals and purposes in the world. That's why, okay, he has been doing this.
We're still talking about Egypt-African relations, but since we mentioned South Africa and since there is a development in The Hague regarding the just Palestinian cause where Egypt is joining and where South Africa, of course, is also there, and since we can't have a debate issue, a topic without mentioning Gaza, and since really Gaza does influence, also, I mean, Gaza is also an element connecting the dots, as you say. I mean, nothing is off topic, and since Gaza is part of the Egyptian-African relationship, also on the coordination, where do you see things in Gaza going, and the stalemate? How do you see the stalemate? Is there a stalemate? And what can Egypt and Africa do more to help the oppressed in occupied Palestine?
Okay, first of all, I strongly believe that there is always hope. Okay, about this. I know situation is so sober, you know, it's foggy, it's not clear enough. However, I still believe that there is hope about this. But if we go back to The Hague, I'd like to highlight something because the other day, okay, that I was listening to the statement being made by the Egyptian delegation over there, and it was impressive in my mind. I'm not exaggerating. It was impressive because, you know, Egypt was very clear that, okay, you are weaponizing humanitarian aid. Okay, and this violates everything about when it comes to international law. And I think it's very clear. You know, I know that 40 countries, an international organization, they are now at The Hague defending and explaining that, okay, that about the urgency of humanitarian aid going into Gaza. But on the other hand, you know, Israel, by the way, is not there. Okay, however, Unites for America is there, and the head of the American delegation there made a statement that I still find it as not only unacceptable, actually I'm out of words, I don't know how to describe this, because he said that is what Israel is not actually bound, you know, it doesn't have any sort of responsibility to provide humanitarian aid. And actually I was shocked. You know, no, according to the international law, you know, as an occupying force, they have to do this. You want to defend Israel, we get it. You have your own agenda, we get it too.
1945, the New World Order, the Geneva Conventions, but maybe, again, maybe Mr. Trump and those in Israel, the right-wing extremists are looking for a new world order. I mean, they talk every day about changing the face of the Middle East, changing, you know, changing everything.
Yeah, I get it as well. However, you know, we shouldn't forget about the ongoing suffering of our brothers and sisters in Gaza. And we
human
see
beings.
This on, exactly. We're
even if they were not Arabs or Muslims.
Simply put, as you said,
they are human beings.
Human beings. And they have their own rights as human beings. And why actually we've been talking about... Okay,
even if they were not occupied, by the way. They are human beings.
Basically, they are
deserve
human
life.
beings. They deserve life, they deserve the basic necessities. You know, the basic needs to be provided. You know, but if we go back to the New World Order, you know, I'm talking about 1945 onwards, okay, we've had hopes, high hopes about that system in the world. But one country, and I think that country has been violating international law, very, very clearly since 1948, and it's Israel. And everyone knows about this. United America has been wholeheartedly defending Israel, but I think since October actually 7th, and I think United America finds this as very difficult. You know, they go to international organization, and we've been seeing the situation at the Security Council as well. You know, but when it comes to humanitarian aid, I think that has exposed the international organization and the international community in general.
Speaking of the new challenges and Mr. Trump's, if I can say, new world order that he wants to impose, the tariffs are part of this so-called new world order. How will these tariffs affect the African continent, and how can Egypt and its African partners who are seeing a rise in trade and in investment, inner trade and inner investment, how they can face up to this newest economic challenge now, the tariffs?
Okay, two different areas. Okay, positive, okay, and the other one is negative. Okay, I would start with the negative one, then we move to the positive side.
Okay.
Okay, on the negative side, okay, whatever happens in the world, economically speaking, the first continent that pays the price, or the price tag that we see it very clearly, unfortunately, it's Africa. And I should remind everyone of the pandemic, COVID-19. Africa, by the way, in economic terms, we've been suffering from the consequences of COVID-19. Okay, you know, European countries, they have been recovering because their economies are way stronger. You know, South America is the same thing. You know, however,
they recovered before anybody. I mean, the US jumped, really.
Okay,
yeah.
But when it comes to us, situation is different in Africa. Why? Because the economic infrastructure
First to get hit and last to recover.
Exactly. So our economic infrastructure is fragile. You know, it's not strong. Meaning that, okay, whatever any sort of you know, heft that we receive, it impacts us very severely. So when we want to recover, it takes time and it takes effort. And as long as we're actually, you know, talking about the negative side, I'd like to mention the debt issue, which is very, very heavy. And I think the continent that has been suffering most of this, okay, is Africa, once again. Why, by the way? Okay, on the outside, debts, okay, or loans, in other words, okay, should be seen in a positive light. In my mind, you know, simply put. However, when we see this in action and the complications or the economic results that have been inflicted upon Africa, and I think that's what it's been going on for the last, I think, like what? Okay, 7-8 decades now. We have been trying to get loans from international organizations to help us build our economies, but we see the results heavily indebted to those international organizations like the IMF, like the World Bank, like other international organizations. So, okay, this, and by the way, that's not a simple issue. It's a heavy one on our hearts and our minds as well.
It is.
So I was trying to give that a simple example of the dark side of this, because I think the new system or the new talk, the new words coming from United States of America, especially when it comes to the tariffs thingy, I think, you know, Africa will suffer from this. Okay, but on
you
the
also
other
said,
hand,
there is a positive side. So.
Exactly. On the other hand, I think we are very much potential. And let me highlight something else regarding the positive side. I think it's time now to join forces. And I'd mention a word that has been echoing, you know, for the last, I think, 7 decades now. I think President Nasser mentioned, he was very much into that word, the word solidarity.
Yes.
Okay, that we have to. It's time now for Africans to realize that, you know, relying on other partners, I wouldn't say that's wrong, by the way. Okay, but what I mean is that it's time for us to join forces, to rely on each other. You know, the inter-African, you know, developmental plans, you know, we should work very, very strongly on this. So that's the bright side of this. So instead of taking it fully in a full negative way, so we should actually look at this from a, a positive point of view. It's time to boost our economies. It's time to rely on each other. It's time to rely on the expertise of each other. Okay, and when we go back to Africa in terms of this, okay, and I think a beautiful example in my mind, okay, the dam, okay, of Julius Nyerere, that's, and even the Egyptian companies involved in this, I think, this gives a very, I think, a direct message to everyone in the world. We see two companies, two major companies, Egyptian companies. Okay, I'm not mentioning names. One of them is state-owned and the other one is private.
Good.
So I think even this, it's not a mere coincidence on my side.
It's not.
Okay, why? Because it gives that kind of example to all African countries. The public-private, cooperation or partnership. It's time. We're not saying that, okay, public sector would be out of this.
And the public sector, the Egyptian public sector is with Africa, and so is the private sector in Egypt. Dr. Momtaz, allow us to watch another second and final report, and it will mention, by the way, the Tanzania dam and also the strong Egyptian relations really with all of Africa, but especially with Nile Basin countries. Please stay with us.
President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is keen to prioritize Africa in Egypt's foreign policy. Egypt is always committed to deepening cooperation with African nations upon President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's directives to boost bilateral political, economic and health relations between Egypt and Rwanda. Egypt sees the necessity of strengthening cooperation between Cairo and Kigali to facilitate the supply of Egyptian medicines to the Rwandan market, given their high reputation and competitive prices. The Egyptian logistics zone in Rwanda is of special importance, which aims to promote trade exchange between Egypt and the landlocked country, pointing out that the logistics zone will house a permanent exhibition for Egyptian products. It would facilitate the access of Egyptian companies and investments to the promising Rwandan market. Rwanda also expressed gratitude for Egypt's substantial support in establishing the Magdi Yaqub Rwanda-Egypt Heart Center, which is said to be the first dedicated cardiac hospital in Rwanda and the sub-Saharan region. Egypt is committed to supporting development efforts in Africa, citing Egyptian-constructed Tanzania's Julius Nyerere hydroelectric power project, the JNHPP, as an example. The dam, under construction since 2019 by an Egyptian consortium, it became Tanzania's largest hydropower plant. The project, a joint venture between state-owned Arab contractors and privately held El Suidi Electric, is described as an example of cooperation between African countries in development projects, particularly in the water sector. With a length of 1,025 meters and a storage capacity of approximately 34 billion cubic meters of water, the dam is expected to double Tanzania's energy production, control flooding, and improve agriculture.
Thank you, Manal, again, and Khalid for this report. And we're back here with Dr. Milad Momtaz, the international relations expert in this studio, talking about the Egyptian-African relations. Now, Dr. Momtaz, what role has infrastructure cooperation and such as electricity, transportation projects and so on played in Egypt's outreach to African countries?
I believe that's one of the most challenging topics ever, especially when it comes to Africa. And once again, let me go back to history, because it has a lot actually to be said about this. Since 1945 and onwards, 1950s and 1960s, and the different waves of independence of African countries, one thing, and I'd like to describe it as the launching pad, is infrastructure. you don't have infrastructure, you don't have solid infrastructure, I believe you can do anything, when it comes to developing a country in the world. South America, did that long time ago, especially expanding westwards in the States. Europe has been working on this for a very long time now. Okay, Asia, same way. South America with the help of other countries in the world. But when we look at Africa and the situation of infrastructure, I think that's a very sad story, unfortunately. Because some people, they don't get the fact that roads are not just mere roads. It's not asphalt, it's not gravel, it's not sand. It's lifelines.
But that's how the Romans built their empire.
Exactly, historically speaking, back again to history, I appreciate it. Romans, and that's, by the way, historically speaking, that was, one clear difference as we compare Athenians and the Romans. And despite the fact that philosophically speaking, intellectually speaking,
of course the Athenians were
way better. However, on the other hand, Romans, they were so practical, down to earth as we described them. So they built roads, they built water ducts, and they were the masters, they excelled in this. And that's why they lasted long. So if we want to last long, if we develop, okay, we have to focus on this.
They also, I guess, had more force to protect it, I guess.
Yeah, militarily speaking.
To protect
but
their...
economically speaking, and I would say that infrastructurally speaking, no, they were really smart. They know what they were doing and the purposes. And even, let me tell you what, when it comes to the army, without roads, they wouldn't have been able to make it.
Indeed. So, Dr. Momtaz, you are telling us that it starts from infrastructure. And when you say that it's a sad story, but at the same time, because you always do that, this means that there is great potential in cooperation and in investment in this field in Africa. Huge, huge potential.
Very much. I would say that, okay, the door is wide open now. Okay, because we've been seeking this, we've been wanting this. So I think
it's time to depend on each other, as you mentioned.
Exactly. For example, okay, I said earlier that, we have the expertise. Why don't African countries take advantage of this? And we get our own companies, Egyptian companies, to work and to transfer our expertise to other countries. I mentioned, as well, the example of the hydroelectric power, project, talking about, okay, the dam in Tanzania, and by the way, that's part and parcel of infrastructure, because energy should be secured. How would I build a strong economy without having reliable source of energy? We can't do this. So, and that's why, let me go back to 2016, 2017 in Egypt, and the problem with electricity. And we saw President Sisi getting some German company, a renowned one, a very famous one around the world, and they built massive projects, mega projects in Egypt. And by the way, back then I still recall some people were wondering why we spend billions of dollars. And again, back to the word that you mentioned, it's infrastructure. So I think it's time for Africa to go for this wholeheartedly. They have to focus on infrastructure in every aspect. When it comes to energy, we have to do this. Electricity, okay, we have to focus on green energy because, Africa and Egypt, we are very much potential when it comes to green energy. Solar energy, whatsoever, we have to focus on this. When it comes to roads, when it comes to railways, by the way, which is very important as well.
Yeah, that's the Roman way. If we do it the Athenian way, and taking into consideration that Africa is the most youthful continent in the world, I mean, with the youngest median age in the world, the African continent, how important is the youth empowerment, cultural exchange, investment in education, and how about Egypt's cooperation with its African brothers in this domain? How important is it?
Back to history once again. I like to have a blend of the Roman and Athenian way. We focus on the practical, down-to-earth way. And as you said, I like the intellectual way. because they should go hand in hand. Okay, it's not only about buildings and roads and railways, it's about human beings, the human capital, which is very crucial as well. And if I may talk a little bit about education.
Yes.
Education is a must go to Africans. We have to go for this as well, wholeheartedly. So yeah, I was talking about roads and buildings, railway tracks, but on the other hand, we have to have very strong education systems at the same time. Okay, so like building schools, building universities, focusing on research centers, labs, very modern labs, and I shouldn't forget something else.
That's investing in the human capital.
Yeah, and I should forget something else regarding human capital, IT.
Yeah, of course.
Technology is a must nowadays as well. And unfortunately to Africans, we are very much behind. And we have to do our best to catch up with this. Because if we look, eastwardly, and we see Asians and what they've been doing, China and India, especially in that field of IT.
Who's Africa's best friend today? I mean, is it Europe? Is it China? Is it... I don't know who is it. Is it the Arab Gulf countries? Was it the USA, but it's no longer going to be the USA, or was it never the USA? Who's Africa's major big friend and partner?
Okay, first of all, if you don't mind, okay, the word friend is kind of difficult, and I would say that maybe Egypt is credible, because
of course,
I find
but Egypt is African.
What I mean is that the word friend is very valuable to myself. And I find when we use the word partner, it's more practical. So, because I find that Africa has been open to everyone in the world. Okay, it was open arms since 1950s and 1960s. Okay, but the way that we have been welcomed actually, different, unfortunately.
The way you've been treated.
Exactly, So if we go back to what you said about, for example, like China, okay, I wouldn't mind. China has been playing a very active role in Africa, especially, when it comes to the field of infrastructure, as we've been talking. Okay, which is, by the way, Western countries, United States of America, they have been objecting to this. They've been saying that, okay, wow, okay, China now, it's, and can you imagine that they have been describing, the Chinese policy in Africa as colonization. I cannot imagine that Western countries, especially European,
dared to say so.
Okay, exactly, to mention that word and describe some other country like this.
Yeah. Unfortunately, our time is up. We still had really a lot to talk about, but it's always nice to be talking to you, Dr. Milad Momtaz, the international relations expert, our dear guest with us here in the studio. Thank you very much, and we hope to follow up on many of these topics in the upcoming episodes. And thank you, dear viewers, for watching us. And please stay with Nile TV.